So there might be a time when you're working in Resolve and you've created transparency, either using a key or in this case, I've used a magic mask to pull a nice clean matte of this guy. There might be times when you want to actually render that out, that alpha channel out to a standalone file on disk and maybe send it to a VFX artist who might be doing beauty work on your footage. Or actually another good use for that is to re-import that mask into Resolve, specifically in the case of Magic Mask, because Magic Mask, well, it's magical. It's not so magical in terms of its reliability. It's very volatile. So a lot of times what you want to do is you want to render the mask that Magic Mask creates, render that out to a file on disk so it never has to recalculate or retrack, and you can re-import this mask back in Resolve. So in order to do that, you need to render this clip with an alpha channel. So the easiest way to do that in Resolve is on the clip that you've got your transparency that you want to output, you want to add an alpha output to the node graph. The way you do that is you right click in the node graph and choose add alpha output. And then you can see this little blue dot show up. So what you're going to want to do is connect the matte output of the node that contains the transparency to that alpha output. And the node can have transparency created by anything that creates transparency, like qualifier, or if you've got a power window, anything that creates transparency, the transparency channel will be fed out of this output. So you want to feed that out to that alpha output. And from there, it's a pretty simple process of just going to the delivery page. I've already got a render set up here. The key thing here is you want to render to a codec that supports a built-in alpha channel. In this case, I'm using ProRes 444. And then the other key is to enable this export alpha option. As a side note, I think in the past you weren't able to do this unless you were in individual clips mode. But at least in Resolve 19 Beta 4, this works even if you're in single clip mode. So you might see some comments on the forum saying you can't use individual clips, but at least in my testing, it seems to work now with single clip. So for whatever that's worth. One thing I did notice is that in single clip mode, you can't choose the alpha channel mode, whether pre-multiplied or straight. If you change it to individual clips, you can choose between pre-mult and straight. So I believe it renders out with a pre-multiplied alpha if you're using single clip mode. So in most cases, that's not a big deal. Okay, so as long as you've got the codec set properly and the alpha, export alpha enabled, you can just render this thing out to disk. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to load this up in a video playback app that I love to use called Screen. It's a kind of a replacement app for QuickTime Player that I really highly recommend that you use if you are a professional video artist on the Mac. One of the cool things it can do that QuickTime Player cannot do is it can actually show you the RGB channels individually. And then also, it can show you an alpha channel. So if I go to isolate channel, show alpha, it shows you the alpha. And you can see that the alpha channel from that Magic Mask is now embedded in this file. Okay, so that works. So that's the basic workflow for getting the transparency of a node out to a standalone render file. So let's talk about some of the caveats with this workflow now. So if you're using Resolve 19, so at the time I'm recording this, the current version of Resolve 19 Beta is 19 Beta 4. I doubt that this issue will be resolved in the final release version 19, so I'm just going to call attention to it. One of the nice new features of Resolve 19 is this thing called, so if you go into the project settings and go into general options, there's this new feature called Node Stack Layers. So it defaults to 1, which is how Resolve always worked. But if you set this to something like 2 or 3 or 4, let's go 3, you can see these layers show up. And what this does in your node graph, you can actually separate your node graph into multiple layers. So what this allows you to do is you separate your node graphs into a more organized fashion. So if you want to put maybe your primary grades in L1, you just do that. And then maybe put your secondaries into L2. And that way you don't have a giant messy node graph showing all these things. So that's a nice feature to have. However, if let's just pull a crappy key here just to get to the point here. So let's say you pulled a key on L1. Okay, and then we do the same thing we did before where we add an alpha output, feed the matte output of the node to the alpha output. Okay, and then let's render this clip again. So we'll export the alpha again and then re-render this clip. But now, if we look at this clip, and then we go to image, isolate channel, alpha, there is no alpha channel. We're only getting the fill part of the image. Okay. So that might trip you up if you're used to doing this with a pre-Resolve 19 workflow where you're not using node stacks. The issue with that is the alpha output is not passed through automatically to these subsequent node stack layers. So you can see that if we show highlight mode on this node, it doesn't show you an alpha. And it's because you need to feed the alpha output of one node stack layer to the other layer below it. The way to do that is to add a source. So if you go right click in the node graph and go add source, you see a second input. And usually that's used for stuff like HDR sources and stuff. So it separates the HDR part of the signal from the standard part of the signal, and that's how you feed it to other parts of the node graph. So it's kind of a confusing option here because I guess it's kind of a generic term. Add source, basically the behavior of what comes out of this depends on the context in which you use it. In this case, since we're feeding the alpha output from the previous clip stack level, this add source, what we're getting here now is the alpha output of the previous node stack. And there you can see that we're getting the alpha channel. So what you need to do is actually repeat the process of adding an alpha output to each level of this node stack. And then do the same for the other subsequent node stacks. We add a source, connect the second source to the mat input of the node, and then add another alpha output, and then send that out. And then now when we render this, now we render this. So now we can see that it has an alpha channel. So that's one workflow caveat when you're using node stack layers, but you want to output alpha from a grade in Resolve 19. Interesting thing, however, what I found, let's just say you had this clip in a group. So now it's a group clip. You can see the green link. Now we have group pre-clip, group post-clip. I'm going to just do it in, I'm going to pull the key in layer 3 so I don't have to do this all over again. But let's pull a key again. Okay. And then add the alpha output. So now we got the key in level 3 of the node stack layer. Now if you go to group post clip, which technically comes after the clip layers, you can see that we're still getting actually if you toggle highlight mode on the post clip node, you can see that there's no transparency there. Okay. So that might lead you to think that this is not going to work for outputting transparency. But as it turns out, if you render this, it does. So that thankfully allows you to output that alpha channel, even though you're in a grouped clip. So that would be the one exception to this. You don't have to, in fact, you can't add additional sources or outputs to a post clip or pre-clip layers. However, it will pass through the alpha output of anything in the clip level. As long as if you're using node stack layers, as long as you're feeding an alpha output to the output of the last layer in the clip layer stack, and then the alpha channel will go through. So that is a nice handy way to output mats. Now, this is going to be a subject of a second video I'm going to make. This helps a lot when you're working with Magic Mask, because Magic Mask is magical. However, it really sucks in terms of your general grading workflow because it's super volatile. Like if you pull a Magic Mask in, let's say, clip level 2 here, and then you do anything before it, upstream from it, if you change anything, any aspect of a node that comes before it, you're going to have to retrack that Magic Mask. And what's even worse is that the results of the Magic Mask disappears. So all of a sudden you'll see, why does my grade look funny now? It's because it invalidates itself if it notices that anything upstream of the node is changed. And that's a super annoying behavior that I hate. And that's the reason why I tend not to use Magic Mask. I tend to use After Effects Roto Brush, which will be the subject of another video I have. But if you really like using Magic Mask, that's one workaround to this issue with the Magic Mask, is you just bake out the matte from the Magic Mask, re-import it into Resolve, and then use it as a external matte. Bring that matte in, and then you can use that as an external matte. And you can see you can actually use that as a mask for this node. One problem, though, with external mattes in Resolve is that most of the time, the external matte comes in and does not align exactly to the clip. You actually have to go into the key panel and then change the offset value to align with the clip. You have to drag this offset to make sure it aligns. And the problem with Resolve Color Page, it's not like Fusion where you can send the output of this node to the viewer, but then change the parameters of another node and see what happens to the downstream node. You can't do that in the Color Page. So you're kind of guessing. It's just like this really annoying trial and error thing where you're changing the offset here and then going back, clicking back on the node, seeing if it aligns, and that is just a freaking nightmare. So that's another reason why I don't use Magic Mask. I try to avoid it. Even as great as it is, I avoid it, and I use After Effects for pulling my mattes, because not only are the mattes easier to pull, there's a trick in After Effects, that workflow, where it makes this key offset, external matte offset, easier to determine. It's instantaneous, so you can figure it out. But I'll show that in another video, but just to let you know that even though this is a good workaround for Magic Masks disappearing, you still have to contend with this annoying external matte offset issue. So tune in for my subsequent video on this, and I'll show you how to work around that.